During the cold part of the year, I like to wear linen caps around the house to keep my head warm. I made 4 or 5 of them several years ago, which is not very many in the first place, and now they're wearing out pretty badly. So I had to make some more of them, and since they're a useful wardrobe staple, I figured I should make a video about it. I will be making 2 different styles, one which is 18th century and another one which is not specifically meant to be historical. These are for my everyday wardrobe, so historical accuracy is not my main concern, but the first one in the video is hand sewn. It's based on a style of men's cap that was worn in the 18th century, both at home and at work. The earliest example I've seen is in a Hogarth series from the 1730s, but I've not done any sort of exhaustive search, so I'm sure there must be earlier ones out there. Sometimes you see them worn with an extra ribbon tied around the head, which is very cute. There are some other, more complicated variations on the style, but for now I'm just going to stick to a simple tube. Burnley and Trowbridge has a video about making this kind of cap, which I will link in the description. I filmed most of this video back in the spring, and had not watched their tutorial yet, so I didn't know that the historical ones have a narrow hem on both ends, and the bottom edge gets folded up, even though in hindsight it looks pretty obvious in a lot of the portraits. But as I said in the intro, these are for me to wear at home, and not meant to be strictly accurate, so this is just the way I've been making them. My not quite accurate cap has one lengthwise seam, a wide hem, and a narrow hem. My favourite fabric to use for these is medium weight linen. The important things are that it's soft enough to be comfortable on the forehead, and that it has a bit of stretch on the cross grain. This off-white linen has been in my stash for ages, and I will use it for the first cap. This turquoise stuff is cotton with a similar kind of squishy texture to the linen. I also tried this lighter weight shirt linen, and it worked fine too. The pattern could not be more simple, as it's just 2 measurements. My head measures 59 centimeters around, and I cut my cap 60 centimeters wide, minus the 2 centimeters of seam allowance, one for each side. This gives me a centimeter of negative ease. It sounds like a lot for woven fabric, but the linen stretches out enough to make up for it. The width measurement, being the one that goes around the head, must be on the cross grain where the stretch is. If I were to cut it so the straight grain went around the head, it might end up too tight. The length is 43 centimeters, and once both ends are hemmed, the final cap will be about 36 centimeters long. I'm measuring out from one corner and snipping into the edge of the fabric to mark my starting point. As with any rectangular linen project, I'm pulling threads to give me a straight line to cut along. I'm pulling out one thread as carefully as I can until it breaks, and then cutting along the line it left. This edge is frayed in the wash and needs to be trimmed. I'm alternating between the 2 cuts until they meet at the other corner. I then line up and pin the 2 shorter sides. I'm using fine white linen thread and waxing it. I tied a knot in the end of my thread and sewed up this seam with a backstitch. I ran out of thread just a little bit before the end of the seam, and had to tie it off from the back and start a new thread. A backstitch has a neat and tidy looking side with short stitches and an untidy side with longer ones, so I'm felling my seam allowance to cover the untidy stitches, and will trim down the seam allowance on that side, though you could also scooch one edge a little further in before you sew it. Because the bottom will have a very wide hem, I don't need to fell the whole thing. I'll have about 1 centimeter of the end folded under, 4.5 centimeters folded up, and another 4.5 centimeters of the inside of the cap covered up by that hem. So I'm clipping into the seam allowance just about 9 centimeters up from the end of the seam. I'm pressing the seam allowance all to one side to cover the shorter one, and tucking the longer one under and pinning it, except for that 9 centimeter section below where I clipped. Then felling it down with a small whip stitch. This is the same way you would do a lot of the seams if you were hand sewing an 18th century shirt or shift. For the wide hem at the bottom, I'm measuring 10 centimeters up from the cut edge and marking a line there with fabric pencil all the way around. Then I'm folding under a centimeter of the edge, bringing it up and pinning it down to that marked line. I do it on the seam first to make sure it's lined up. Then I sew it down with a small whip stitch. I must once again mention that the wide hem is not accurate for the 18th century ones. Sometimes I do a bunch of research before starting something, and sometimes my head is just cold and I need something to put on it. I'm tying off the thread and burying the end under the hem. For the top hem, I'm just folding under a tiny bit without measuring, and whip stitching it down in the same way. The bottom hem needs a press to make that edge nice and crisp, and then it's finished. Now I just need to scrunch up the top and tie it shut. I don't know if the 18th century ones had a drawstring or were sewn shut, but I like doing mine like this because then it can easily go back to lying flat, so it takes up less drawer space. For this one I'm using a piece of silk satin ribbon, about 73 centimeters long. The machine sewn version is much the same. I'm cutting a 60 centimeter by 43 centimeter rectangle of this shot blue and green cotton by pulling threads. I'm using polyester all-purpose thread just because that's what I had in my stash in the right color, and sewing the short sides together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Trimming one seam allowance to be shorter and clipping 9 centimeters up from the hem. And then pressing it on my sleeve board so that the wider seam allowance covers the shorter one. I'm folding the edge under and pinning it down, still on top of the sleeve board, but being careful not to catch the sleeve board cover with the pins. It's easier to get at the folded seam allowance with the machine if it's turned to the inside. I'm starting at the bottom and just top stitching it down in a straight line all along the folded edge. Then I folded in that small hem for the top edge, just like before. On my machine sewn linen shirts I hand baste these little hems before sewing them, but this cotton stays in place well enough that I don't need to do that. I'm sewing close to the edge all the way around, pulling the pins out as I go, and backstitching at either end of course. I mark the fold line for the big hem, press in the edge, line it up, and whip stitch it. This is the one part I'm hand sewing on this cap because I worry that machine stitching wouldn't stretch as much around my head. After pressing the hem, I tied the top closed with this dark teal silk braid I made a few years ago. I've got a couple other bits of braided silk yarn that I'm using on these caps, and would like to make some more. The second style of cap has a rounded top and is made with two pieces. This one was inspired by a picture I saw on Pinterest that leads to a dead link and which I can't find any other records of. The Williamsburg collection has one with a similar rounded top that's dated to the 18th century, but it's much longer with a narrow hem, and the bottom is rolled up just like the other ones. So mine was never meant to be specific to any period. I just wanted a smaller, closer fitting cap for practical reasons. My pattern was made by taking half my head circumference for the width, half the measurement from temple to temple for the height, drawing a dome shape, and then doing a quick mock-up. But that was over 7 years ago, so I don't remember if it needed many adjustments. It's got straight sides, so I can fold up a really wide hem. I'm tracing my pattern onto a bit of medium weight linen with fabric pencil, once again making sure the stretchy or cross grain goes horizontally around the head. It might have been more convenient if I'd included the very wide hem in my pattern instead of having to use my 5cm wide ruler to draw it out, but I didn't. As with all my patterns, this one is made without seam allowance, so the traced line is the stitching line. I cut it out with about 1 centimeter of seam allowance on all edges. I line up my two halves and pin them together. And sew that one rounded seam on the machine. Before trimming the seam allowance, I mark where the top of the hem will be, which is right at the top of the straight sides. I trim about half the width off the bottom part of the seam allowance, since it'll be hidden by the hem. The rest of the seam allowance needs to stay long, but I'm just trimming off a little bit to make it more even. I'm giving that seam a press, first flat on the ironing board and then pressing it open over the tailor's hem. On my first few caps I felled it all to one side just like I do on the tubular ones, but that makes the seam really bumpy and bulky, which makes them uncomfortable when you're wearing headphones. And I wear headphones over caps quite a lot, so now for this kind I fell the seam allowances down separately on both sides. I start folding under and pinning the straight grain sections first, on the middle and ends of the seam. The sections in between that are on the bias and need to be gently squooshed into place around the curve. Once one side is all pinned, I baste it down with old cotton thread using a running stitch. Then pin and baste the other side. Just like the first cap, I'm using white linen thread and waxing it. And whip stitching the edges down as usual. I ran out of thread here and had to tie it off and start again. Then after that's done, I remove the basting. And the hem is done just like the other ones. I pin it to the two seams first before lining up the rest of the marked line, and I stretch it over my hands to see that it's sitting smoothly and evenly before I start placing the rest of the pins. Whip stitch it down with some more of that linen thread, and it's finished! I wear the tubular ones at home. Since there's no seam on the top, they're better suited for headphones. I wear the rounded ones at home too, but I also wear them underneath my cold weather hats when I go out. They're softer than my wool hats and much easier to wash. This does mean I wear them to work in the winter, and I also wear headphones at work, so I'll definitely have to make more of the ones with the flatter seams. All the 18th century examples I've seen are plain white linen, so a lot of mine are more of a historical fantasy sort of cap. I like having a variety of cords and ribbons to tie these with, and I think it would be fun to make some fancier cords with decorative ends, like a pair of tassels or fake flowers or something. And sometimes I don't bother tying the top shut. Sometimes I just wear it like this and it's fine, it still works. Normally at the end of the video I would talk about how the project went and what to improve on, but these are so simple that there's not much to say. Having learned since filming that the 18th century ones have narrow hems on both sides, I think those ones would probably last longer, because I've noticed that right next to the wide hem is the place where they all wear out first. If I was starting from new, having never made any other caps, I'm sure I would have done more research and hemmed it the 18th century way, but I was copying some things I'd made 7 years ago without going back to check. They're not bad caps, just a little less historical than I thought. I could maybe try cutting the rounded one all in one piece, with a sort of curved dart up the front and back so that the top doesn't have a seam along it. That might be a bit less fabric efficient, but better for wearing headphones at work. One cap that did turn out badly is this one that's way too short, but that's because I made it at work without my pattern. I know this video was not particularly autumnal, but the next one will be, and it's much longer. Still a lot of work left to do on the video itself, but I've got a whole bunch of photos of the finished garment up on Patreon. So thank you very much to my patrons for helping me pay my bills, and thank you for watching. I hope some of you will make linen caps. It would be a very good beginner project. Bye!